First of all, I want to introduce myself. Assalamualaikum. My name is Hadeeqa. I am a student at CUNY City College. I am also the president of our chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine, as well as an organizer from the CUNY Gaza Solidarity Encampments. And I'm also a Muslim, which is a label, a title for sure that we want to emphasize because that's kind of that's what our conversation today is going to be about. Talking about navigating these sort of different roles that we're playing all the time and how to keep our Muslim identities front and center and how to navigate the organizing spaces and the activist spaces as people who care about the world, as people who fear Allah, as people who hate genocide. We want to make sure that we are staying firm and principled in how we are organizing to make a difference, inshallah. So, being said, I want to set some intentions for the day. Thank you all so much for joining and taking the time to be here. After 318 days of a genocide, with over 186,000 Palestinians martyred by the Zionist entity in cold blood, in broad daylight, being cheered on by mainstream media, we stand here with heavy hearts, but of course with so much hope and so much faith in our Lord and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and in our ummah to be able to rise above. We draw our inspiration from the people of Gaza. We see mothers holding their children, their babies, forced to bury their babies. And at the end of the day, they say, Alhamdulillah, they say, Hasbi Allah. These mothers and these families give us so much hope. And the movement for Palestine and the resistance that we're seeing is it's just the most profound, most powerful thing ever. The movement for Palestine coming out of Gaza and all of Palestine is nothing short of Islamic, which is something that we are going to focus today's conversation on. It's nothing short of ibadah, it's nothing short of jihad. And today, inshallah, we're going to start to define what those words mean and how exactly we're going to take part in this and how to play it out here in the West and how to do our part and do our role for the sake of Allah and for the sake of doing what Allah would be pleased with, which is to do our role and play our role properly in the pursuit of justice. We understand that, I'm saying this as an activist, it is dangerous and disrespectful to secularize the movement. The fathers of Gaza are leading with Islam in their core and center. We know that the eradication of Islamic frameworks in the movement for Palestine is essentially just its own version of colonization, appropriation, and exploitation, which is something that, inshallah, our guest today will expand on more. We are here to keep Islam front and center. We are making sure that we honor and truly respect our martyrs. When we are secularizing our movement, what we're doing is essentially saying that our martyrs have died. In Islam, we never believe that the one who has been martyred has died. We believe that they're in Jannah, that the children in Jannah are holding hands and playing with Ibrahim alayhi salam. And so when we say that the movement is secular or that people have been murdered, which they have, we are kind of disregarding the fact that we have martyrs and that our people in Gaza are not dead, but they are rather alive and well, and we are going to fight for them in every capacity that we have. So we will honor them and respect them by keeping our firm core grounded in Islam. The complete answers will never be something that includes the material but excludes the spiritual or moral. I'm like reading off of bullet points, so I'm sorry, I'm like realizing I sound a little choppy. But today we're going to talk about how there is the material movement. There is, the conversations of the sort of recognized Western movements that we've been talking about. If you've been involved, if you've been to our protests, if you've been a part of your SJPs, you've heard a lot of conversations about what the answer is and what the real problem is. And inshallah, today we're going to get to the root of that, the root of the problem and the root of the solution, inshallah, by talking about how the spiritual and the moral and the Islamic framework is quintessentially a part of that. So inshallah, I'm also going to pass it off now to Sister Fatima to get us going, inshallah. Bismillah.
Alaikum, everyone. By the way, that was amazing, Hadeeqa. There wasn't points that came out very eloquently, mashallah. So everything that I could have never said very eloquently, Sister Hadeeqa just she put it out there, right? So we're coming with one intention, right, which is the betterment of the ummah. inshallah, the liberation of Gaza, the liberation of Palestine, and ultimately the betterment of society, right? Because when we're talking about Palestine being a Muslim issue, that doesn't mean that we free Gaza and then khalas, right? The whole point of being a Muslim is hoping that everyone lives in a world where moral perfection is conveyed, where moral perfection is the reality, and justice is the reality. So my name is Fatima. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm the former president of Brooklyn College Students for Justice in Palestine. If you're not aware of Brooklyn College, I'm sure you guys are you're all CUNY students here or part of the community. But that was the college where the councilwoman showed up with a gun threatening Muslim students, right? And also Brooklyn College is known to be one of the most Islamophobic institutions in New York City. But alhamdulillah, with the grace of God, we've used the power that He's given us to advocate for Palestine and to advocate for ourselves as Muslims, and also just to do da'wah, right? Because if I'm not going to be the gateway to the freedom of my own people, then inshallah I will be the da'wah to somebody that will lead my people and that will free Gaza, inshallah. So I'm going to start off with some dhikr to purify our intentions. So if you can just start off with Subhanallah 30 times, Alhamdulillah 30 times, and Allahu Akbar 30 times, and inshallah I'll give you guys 2 minutes to do that. Hopefully you've all got a chance to purify your intentions as well, inshallah. So we're going to jump straight into it. The reason that me and Sister Hadeeqa wanted to start this conversation, and as well with Brother Raja and Imam Tom, is that we've seen a gap, right? So although many of us were sitting in this meeting and we come with the assumption that we have brought our Islam to every classroom, to every room that we've ever been in, right? Like we've walked into rooms like, no, I always say I'm Muslim first. Like that comes first. We're often built with this unknowing propaganda, right? This mind washing that comes with having grown up in the West. And that obviously extends to our political beliefs, whether we have none of our own or whether we take from others that are not a part of our Islamic tradition. So I'm just going to start off with my questions, inshallah.
I'm going to actually cut you off because before we do that, I want to introduce our guests, inshallah. We have two really cool guests with us today, alhamdulillah. Thank you guys both for taking the time to be here. First, we have Imam Tom Facchine, who is the Research Director of Islam and Society at the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research. He is also an instructor at Legacy International Online High School, where he teaches tafsir and Islamic history. He also holds a BA in political science from Vassar College and studied in Medina from 2015 to 2020, where he obtained a BA from the Faculty of Sharia and the Islamic University. And his work largely focuses on Islamic political thought and the deconstruction of contemporary ideologies, which inshallah is very, very intertwined with the conversation that we're going to be having today. And then we also have dear Brother Raja Abdelhaq, who is a Palestinian political activist and a community organizer. Brother Raja is the co-founder of Goods News Network and a former executive director of the Islamic Leadership Council of New York. And Brother Raja has a master's degree in political science from Brooklyn College. Shout out CUNY alum. And what this also means is that we have 4 poli-sci majors in the chat, which means it could go one of 2 ways. It could either go really well or no, it'll go really well, inshallah. And inshallah, we're going to keep it really concise and on point, and we won't yap too much, inshallah. So I'm going to pass it to Sister Fatima now.
You're going to have to forgive me. It's a first-time thing. You know what I'll blame it on? You both don't need introduction. Your reputation precedes you, mashallah.
You killed
Okay,
that. You saved that one. You killed it.
So let's get straight into it. Why is Palestine a Muslim issue from a spiritual and a material perspective? Imam Tom, if you'd like to start us off.
I was going to ask for Rajat to start.
Okay.
If you don't mind, Imam, starting from your perspective, then I can add to it, because I think it would be great to the Islamic one. Yeah.
أبشر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا وقدوتنا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة وأزكى التسليم. First of all, thank you to the organizers for putting this on. This is a great, much needed conversation. This conversation needed to happen 10 months ago, but alhamdulillah, better late than never. And it needs to be spread. I firmly believe. Palestine is a Muslim issue for, well, I want to, in true poli-sci fashion, I'm going to deconstruct the question a little bit. There's a difference between being a Muslim issue and being an Islamic issue, right? And we need to pay attention to that, because just as I think one of the reasons why we're here is that we find that there is a certain allowance for a Muslim presence within activism and advocacy on Palestine, but there is much less room for Islamic activism and advocacy on Palestine. And those are 2 different things, right? That yes, Islam is an identity, but is much more than an identity. It is also an episteme. It's also a way of viewing the world. It's also a set of practices. It believes certain things about, heaven and hell, afterlife. It has a certain theology, has a certain anthropology, has a certain definition of what a human being is, right? So all of these things are really, really important versus to understand, is it a Muslim issue, an Islamic issue, both, okay? But the really interesting sort of thing, is this an Islamic issue, and why? And if you say the latter, is it an Islamic issue? Well, then we have to have some sort of understanding of, well, what does Islam say about Palestine? Obviously, Islam says a whole lot about Palestine. Palestine is in the Quran. It is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has honored with his own eternal words, Azza wa Jal, in Surah Al-Isra and in other places where he said that it is a blessed place. It is a place that holds one of the 3 holiest sites on the face of this earth for Muslims, in Bayt al-Maqdis and Masjid al-Aqsa. It is a place where it is the land of prophets that Muslims recognize. It is a place of the Isra and Mi'raj. It is the place where the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was carried by night and then ascended into the 7 heavens. Allah Azza wa Jal could have decided to take him straight up from Mecca, but he did not. He brought him, alayhi salatu salam, to Al-Quds first to honor it, and then to bring him up to the 7 heavens to eventually give him the salah. It is a place where the first direction of prayer, where Muslims, when they migrated to Medina, they first faced Al-Quds before they faced the Kaaba in Mecca. And it is the place where the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ talked about al-Ta'ifa al-Mansura. He said that there would be a group of people among his ummah, meaning a subsection of his ummah, that would stay upon the truth. لا يضرهم من خالفهم. He said, and it would not hurt them whoever betrayed them. In another riwayah, من خذلهم, whoever betrayed them. So it's an amazing prophecy from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, where he said that there's going to be a group in this ummah, and other people in the ummah are going to sell them out. Other people in the ummah are going to betray them, but they will not be affected by it. They are going to continue to stay on that pure Islam that Allah is pleased with, was the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, until the Day of Judgment. And who were these people? The Prophet ﷺ was asked, and he said in one riwayah, he said Sham. In another riwayah, he said, Hum bi Bayt al-Maqdis. So he said, these are the people of Palestine, of Al-Quds. That this is a very, very special place. And subhanAllah, in my travels, I was, in Dublin, and there was a Palestinian uncle. There are a lot of people from Palestine that have, part of the diaspora that are in Dublin. And this one uncle said to me something that I'll never forget, inshallah. He said that Mecca is a symbol or like a litmus test of how a Muslim feels towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Medina is a test for how you feel towards the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Palestine is a test for how you feel towards the Ummah of Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. That if you don't have this thing in your heart that cries out and screams for the people in the land of Palestine, then you are not a proper Muslim. You are not a properly constituted Muslim. You are off. Somewhere along the way, you've been programmed wrong. You've been brainwashed. You've been, taken over. Maybe it's nationalism. Maybe it's, white supremacy. Whatever it is, you're off. And so it is a yardstick by which you measure yourself. And so I'll pass it to Raja off of that.
Jazakumullah khair, Imam. Really well put in that regard. And this is why I think it was important for us to start off with you, to provide it from an Islamic perspective, as you mentioned, and what Islam says about the land of Palestine, specifically in the cause. I think one area that we want to look at Palestine, besides the Islamic perspective and what Islam has to say about the cause and the issue of Palestine, has to do with the material analysis of the issue of Palestine. As many people know, when we talk about Palestine, we talk about a simpler colonial project, meaning that you have a foreign entity, or in this area, foreign colonizers that came from Europe. And it's very important for us to link the Zionist movement that is coming from Europe with the colonial powers in specifically in Europe in the 19th century. So Zionism is an extension of European colonialism, whereas European colonialism was about the concept of sending boots on the ground and the concept of stealing resources, exploiting resources, and sending the money and the interest and the benefit to the metropolitan. And in the 19th century, metropolitan used to be London or Paris, depending on the empire. Zionism as a settler colonial project was a little bit different, in the sense of the purpose of it is to replace the native with the colonizers, the native with the new occupiers that come from Europe. And that is the difference between the classic colonialism and settler colonialism. What's important about this, in the concept of whether this is a Muslim issue or not, is that Palestine, when you look at the natives of the land of Palestine, because as we said, that the issue of Palestine is this formula of the colonizers and the colonized, you have to look at it from what defines the cause, and what the definition of the cause is, as I mentioned, the colonizer and the colonized. The colonized in this concept are the natives of the land. And the natives of the land happen to be the Palestinians. And the Palestinians are the owners of the land, and they are the part of that struggle. And the concept of settler colonialism is the erasure of the identity and the civilization and the history and the culture of the owners of that land. So in this essence, we are basically saying that the land of Palestine, or the question of Palestine, has to do with this native and the reality of the native, because in order for settler colonialism to win and to be victorious, they have to erase the identity of the natives in order for the new identity to come about. And the best example of this is the United States of America, or Australia, or even Canada, the concept that the European white man who came to these colonies committed genocide against the natives, replaced their history, erased their culture, erased their language, erased their identity, erased their religion and their spiritual connection with that land, and replaced it with a new one. So, from a material perspective, Palestine is a Muslim cause because the natives of that land, the majority of them are Muslims. Even Christians and Jews of that land, who are part of the struggle or part of that land, the natives of that land, are considered part of the Muslim civilization. And you have Palestinian Christian thinkers like Azmi Bishara, for example, who's a big Christian Palestinian thinker, has been saying that even though he's Christian in his faith, he is Muslim when it comes to the to civilization that he belongs to. So in essence, even when we're using secular means, even when we're using political science means, so even when we're using social sciences to define and identify the Palestinian cause, at the end of the day, it is a Muslim cause because the natives are culturally, historically, spiritually, and according to their faith, are Muslim in reality. So the hope of the Zionist movement is to erase this identity of the natives of the land, and the best way to do it is to erase their faith. And this is when we say that the erasure of the faith of the natives of the Palestinian people, specifically their religion, Islam, is in essence helping the Zionists in their propaganda. Because if you erase the identity of the natives, if you erase their Islam, if you erase their religion, then you're technically removing the native identity of the land, and in essence, you're basically helping the settler colonialism in achieving their goal in erasing that culture and that identity. So even if you deny everything Imam Tom mentioned about the connection of the land, the Islamic importance of that land, and its connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you cannot ignore and dismiss the reality on the ground, which is in essence, even if you use a material analysis, the identity of the natives is very important in fighting the settler colonial project. So signifying and making it clear that Palestinians are Muslims, whether their faith or their culture or their civilization are Muslims in essence, you are basically making sure that this cause is protected from being taken over by the colonizers' propaganda. I think I'll stop here. I'll expand more as we go forward.
For that, and both of those responses very, very deep, very good for setting the framework for this conversation, because I think that is just a great stepping stone to have this conversation. It's hard to talk about Islam's role without understanding these really important elements. So, we know that, like you both mentioned, when you're fighting for the sake of Allah, when you are living and worshiping Allah, that intrinsically means that you are fighting for Palestine in every means and every way that you can. And with that being said as well, we're kind of talking about making the movement Islamic, and just like navigating how to do that. And so Imam Tom, he called us out recently, and I'm saying us by like organizers. I'm a big fan of the podcast at Yaqeen, and a lot of us organizers, we do tend to like try to reinvent the wheel by reframing our organizing and our activism for Palestine through liberation ideologies that have been recognized in the West. So we'll frame it through the lens of, ideologies that are palatable for non-Muslims. And so my question is, what is that impact? What is the impact that shifting to an Islamic framework could make for the broader movement here in the West? And what does that look like in practice for both of you?
I'm just going to go off of something that Raj just said, which is extremely important, which is to understand that colonization is not just about the removal of material resources or the murder of bodies or the expulsion of people from land, but is also the elimination of worldviews and epistemes. That it is just as much, or, depending on the case, sometimes even more, concerned with eliminating the epistemic sovereignty of people. Okay, so that means that people have sacred teachings, and if we have a really good model for in Western Hemisphere, a lot of indigenous groups and Native Americans have made this similar argument that we have the schools like the Carlisle School and the boarding schools that were forced and imposed upon indigenous peoples of these lands, and they were all geared towards hollowing out the inside subjectivity, right? If you're into Foucault, this is disciplinary power par excellence, right? This is exactly what it means. Like you're, killing the Indian, saving the man, or whatever was the phrase that were used by these particular colonizers. That this is an entire dimension of the issue, and so we have to make sure that that isn't lost, that we realize the quintessential post-colonial problem, that you can resist colonialism on the terms and from within the episteme of the colonizer. And if you do that, then your resistance movement is really just going to be like a subtle reform movement within the colonial sort of paradigm and apparatus. And this has happened a million times throughout history. That you have to make sure that you maintain your epistemic sovereignty. We're talking about Allahu Akbar. We're talking about martyrs. We're talking about jihad. We're talking about these things that are epistemically ours. They are Muslims. They are indigenous. They are sacred teachings. And the premise here is that you cannot separate us from our sacred teachings. And to do so is actually a very particular tactic of colonialism. So there's that issue about maintaining our sovereignty. Okay, there's a second issue about, what does it mean to reintroduce in a secular age, in an age in which secularism has very much been part of the colonial project. If you haven't read the book, The Myth of Religious Violence by William Cavanaugh, it's a highly recommended book to demonstrate how part and parcel the secularizing force, especially later colonialism, when you get into the 19th century onwards, was to the colonial project. They never wanted Islam. They never wanted a strong sort of Islamic discourse because it was a threat to their sort of machinations, first of all, but also because what Islam provides to any movement, it provides not only motivation. That's why the CIA decided to arm the Mujahideen in Afghanistan as opposed to anybody else, and they said it explicitly because the believer. What did the companions say when they reached Persia and other lands? They said, "Listen, guys, we love death in the way of Allah more than you guys love your own lives." And in another narration, because they were talking specifically to the Persians, and Persians, they drink a lot of wine, at least before Islam. They say, "We love death more than you guys love wine," right? So that was sort of the attitude. And if you could bottle that and sell it, I guarantee you someone would find a way to buy up and corner the market. That is something that is a level of motivation that doesn't really exist anywhere else. And it's also a level of discipline that doesn't exist anywhere else. That Islam is a complete way of life. It tells you how to use the bathroom. It tells you which shoe you should step into first. It tells you how to cover your body. It tells you how to talk to your parents in a respectful way. It tells you how to be a positive member. It tells you how to go to war. It tells you how to do everything, how to sell and trade and whatever. And so the person who is properly constituted and oriented within an Islamic framework is very hard to buy off. They're very hard to get them to sell out. It's very hard to kind of conquer them with like the sweetness of the world, to bribe them or to pay them off or something like this, because they see a different reality, right? So that is an extremely important. If you know the history of social movements and social justice movements in the United States of America, many of them came, many of them failed. Okay, many of them, the reasons for their failure, obviously there's always push and pull factors, and you can't blame it on any one particular thing, but the U.S. government has definitely demonstrated a history of trying to use shahwa and shubha, right? Just the tools of shaitan, of doubts and like psyops, and then also addictions and getting people, hooked on substances or trying to find them in compromising positions. Look at the Epsteins of the world that have dirt on all these politicians. Look at how even the intelligence forces within occupied Palestine try to get Palestinians hooked onto substances and other sorts of things, try to get them to commit an act of immorality and photo it or record it in order to shame them, in order to blackmail them into being a collaborator, right? Islam fortifies both individual people and an entire movement against all of these types of forces. So I think that that makes it very indispensable.
If I can jump in quickly here, I know Imam connected something I said. I want to connect something he said as well. Is that I think to unpack the question specifically when it comes to the Muslim faith or religious understanding of the cause versus the secular one, we truly cannot remove ourselves from the reality that we are living in a secular age, and that modernity in general as a vision or as a worldview has given birth to colonialism in general. And it's part and parcel. We cannot talk about colonialism without talking about modernity and secularism. Modernity in general, the concept that came out of Europe and through the process of Enlightenment age and eventually until modernity and secularism, the idea is that European powers wanted to replace the metaphysical God with, or to replace God, the divine, by the state. So have this transcendental God to be replaced by the state itself. And in essence, by removing that, you want to control the world through the nation state itself, as we see it today. And unfortunately, the reality is we are byproduct of the secular age, meaning that the first thing we always think about anytime we want to explain something is to look at it from a secular lens more than anything. And I'll give you a small example from an Islamic perspective. Anytime we talk about Ramadan every single year, people, the first thing they jump to, specifically in our aunts and uncle WhatsApp messages, is that fasting is healthy for you. That's the first thing that people think about. In reality, fasting is not healthy for you. I know people will be triggered now by me saying this, because one time I gave khutbah about this, and literally half of the masjid came to me, not half the masjid, but at least 10 people came to me after, being really upset, because in their mind, Islam should not contradict secularism. And anytime Islam, or when we say something about Islam that contradicts secularism, then something is wrong. As if like our worldview has been shattered in front of us because we wait for science and secularism to prove that Islam is the right thing to do. And we do that by saying, oh, if you wake up for Fajr, there is a specific breeze in the morning that is healthy. When you pray like specific rak'at and specific ways you're held in your body, we're trying to use science and secularism to justify a metaphysical connection that we have with God. And that doesn't make any sense. So my point of saying this, I'm not trying to trivialize the Palestinian cause, but the reality is, whether we like it or not, we are byproduct of secularism. And the easiest thing for us is to say religion has nothing to do with the Palestinian cause, and specifically as the way Imam Tom mentioned it. Now, let me say something, and I don't want to sound like I'm contradicting myself here. Palestine as a cause is not a religious cause per se, meaning that the root cause of the cause is not religious war between Jews and Muslims. On the contrary, it's a secular quote unquote conflict or cause, in a sense that it can be explained by using political science terms, meaning it's a secular colonial project that is agnostic to the reality on the ground, meaning that Palestinians as natives did not choose for their colonizers to be Jews. They just happened to accept or there happens to be that the colonizers claim to be Jews, and that's the reality. At the same time, the Zionist pioneers, who were agnostic and atheists when they came up with the idea of Zionism and creating the colonial project in Palestine, they did not explicitly choose Palestine because the natives were Muslims per se. So all of these things are secondary issues, secondary reality to the cause itself. However, the reality is the natives of the land are free to use their own faith and their religion to defend their lands. And that's exactly what we're seeing today. So, but the world now, specifically America and the colonial West, they want to take away from us that reality because it's easier for them to sell a so-called peace process if we remove religion from it. Because as Imam Tom mentioned, if we as Muslims believe that this land is holy and blessed, and we cannot give it away to colonizers using Islamic text, then if you get rid of the Islamic text, then it becomes reasonably normalize that we can accept to get rid of some of the land of Palestine and give it to colonizers, because there's no divine wisdom, there's no divine order for us to protect this land by any means necessary. And finally, I want to say something very clearly, and this is removing a little bit the Islamic perspective from it. The reality on the ground is that the resistance movement, or the Palestinian movement in general, before the rise of Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the 80s, specifically after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, has been secular in its practice, meaning that their identity was always Islamic. They never denied their Islamic identity. However, because of the conflict between Russia, the Soviet Union, and America, the leftists, or the Palestinian movement at that time, was either leftist or secular. Fatah or the PFLP was mostly endorsing a secular perspective or secular mindset because of their relationship with the Soviet Union. And because of that, the majority of immigration of Palestinians to America were driven by leftist politics. And there's nothing wrong with that at that time. That was the reality of the Palestinian cause. So in essence, the majority of the Palestinian movement narrative that exists in America and in Europe specifically were mostly driven by leftist voices. Even though Muslims have risen, specifically after the 80s, and have claimed the narrative as a Muslim cause as well, they were still not as outspoken as the leftists, because the leftist has more influence in universities, they have degrees in social sciences, they invested time and resources into theorizing for the Palestinian cause. And this is something that is very important to us. Even though I'm someone who has an Islamic understanding of the worldview, I benefited dearly from them. Now, the reality also, after the war and terror campaign, after the September 11 events, Muslims in general are afraid to talk about Palestine from an Islamic perspective, because to them, I have to remove my Islamic identity when I talk about Palestine, because I don't want to be falling under the bad Muslim dichotomy when it comes to the war and terror campaign. Meaning that a secular Muslim can freely talk about Palestine, but when someone who has an Islamic identity speaks on Palestine, it becomes a threat. Why? Because they can easily be connected to Hamas. As we've seen nowadays, anybody who says anything about Gaza is automatically said, oh, pro-Hamas activists. And even if though they're leftists or seculars or even non-Muslims, imagine if there were someone with a lihya or a beard and someone who practices Islam, they will automatically be labeled as quote-unquote terrorists. So meaning, in essence, we are subconsciously self-policing ourselves against using an Islamic perspective when we talk about Palestine. So I wanted to provide these different analysis and understanding in terms of why has this movement in general has been secularized beyond just the modernity and secularism that came from Europe, but the material reality that was forced upon us because of the original movement of the early days of the Palestinian movement, specifically after the '67 war. Even though the original first movement against the Zionist entity in Palestine was Islamic in its culture. It was Izzuddin al-Qassam, was a sheikh, was an imam. The early days of the resistance against the Zionist movement were completely Islamic. Later on, after the '67, it started being more secularized. However, now, as we've seen, it's becoming more and more coming through an Islamic perspective.
Thank you for that, Brother Raja. So I think if I want to sort of like, it's really hard to sum up because there's so much here that's so important. But what we're facing is really a war on ideas, right? And with colonialism, I'd say, if anything, Zionism is the greatest example of the most vicious war on ideas, right? Because there's many examples of colonial cruelty, but what Zionism does so well is convince you to condemn yourself while they're eating at your flesh. Right? Like, say you're wrong while you're dying. Say you're wrong while you're dying, right? And it's one of the most cruelest things that Zionism, I believe, has ever done. And it's one of the most legendary things. I think that's what's brought it this long, right? Like, in a lot of ways, I think we're arguing here is secularization is, the reason that we haven't freed Gaza. I mean, there's a lot more to it, of course, but if we had come to a point where we held to our values, Allah Alam, everything's like too, right? But how did we get to this point, right? So I want to sort of structure this argument in a way that's most relevant to us as students, but also as like as Americans, as people who live in America, if you guys don't mind explaining the political positions of Muslims in America in the past 30 years.
I mean, it's kind of a general question, but I want to enter it through adding something to what Raja said, and I totally agree with how he characterized everything. One thing that I find interesting is how the Zionists, even before 9/11, have chosen to use an anti-Islamic discourse to justify their project, right? Even back in the 90s, you can find the Israeli ambassadors going to the US, and this is something I cited in the article for Facchine Institute, um, where they are literally saying, I mean, they have an option, right? You have an option to come before the United States Congress or the presidents or whatever, and you're asking for money, you're asking for bombs, you're asking for protection. Why? What's your sales pitch? What's it's going to be? The Zionists, they could have chosen, far leftists. They could have said communists. They could have said Arab nationalists. They could have said whatever. They didn't. They said Islamic fundamentalists, Islamic terrorists. And they've said that consistently, at least since the 90s. Now, obviously, after 9/11, I mean, that was like even more so. Like they basically were clairvoyant, basically, in the sense that this discourse was going to now catch fire, be exported across the world, and basically everyone and their mom can now call their political enemies terrorists and use it to justify anything. So this became the discourse through which to justify authoritarian crackdowns, settler colonialism, anything, you name it. This, especially if your enemies are vaguely Muslim or vaguely Islamic, it's like that's, you win. You get money, you get support, you get logistics, you get telecoms, you get everything from the US and its imperial allies. So that brings us to, the last 30 years, right? So it's like, so 9/11 happens, and then what is the Muslim reaction? And it's not a monolith, of course, but we can talk in generalities. And what do we have to learn from it? And what does the Zionist decision to make it about Islamic fundamentalism, quote unquote, create like a potential for selling out? Or what does it ask us to exchange? That's a better way of putting it. What does it ask us to give up in exchange for recognition of the Palestinian cause, right? How can it be legible? And what is it asking us to sell in order to make it legible? If you look at after 9/11, my sort of analysis is that Muslims in the United States, by and large, went into hiding. Like they, by and large, hid away from this massive confrontation that was boiling up. Honestly, that was sort of coming to a head. This doesn't have to be a blame game, right? Like we can find justifications and why maybe at that time, like it sort of made a little bit of sense. Perhaps this is an open question, but definitely, the entire artifice of anti-terror legislation, of Patriot Act, of surveillance, of foreign terrorist organization designation, of state sponsor of terrorism organization, which had been going legally since the 60s to criminalize the PLO and everyone after them, right, was brought to bear. The full weight of that apparatus, which is now, by the time 9/11 happens, is like 40 years old, is brought to bear on the Muslims, right? And basically, the Muslims crawled into a hole and basically said, if we can start to do relief work, right, we'll pivot to basically very, very safe things. We'll go with this edutainment model and these conferences, and we'll have conferences every year, and we'll have singers and nasheed artists, and we'll be what I refer to all of this package as biryani diplomacy, that basically, if we're likable enough, you won't kill us, right? If I got a cousin who's a Marine, I'm gonna give him, front stage at ICNA conference or ISNA conference, and they're gonna get a nice, 20 minutes to speak, and it's gonna be we'll bring in Ilhan Omar and the other people that, I'm sorry, I'm naming names. I probably shouldn't name names, but you get the point. It's like respectability politics to the utmost, right? That if we're likable enough, we won't be killed or won't be killable. And what October 7th proved to us is that we'll never not be killable. Muslims will never not be killable if we don't if we don't face this thing head on. And that's sort of my plea to people, like since as the months have gone on, that post 9/11, the Muslim community decided to go for survival. Okay, you can have an open assessment as to how that strategy worked, but it basically kicked the can down the road, and we're facing it now. And this entire thing is not going to go away, and Muslims will never live in peace if they don't face head on the entire legal, discursive, material, ideological apparatus that has been put up against us for the last, now we're at, we're over 50 years. So that's my real situation. And the hopeful thing, and I'll kick it to Raja, is the hopeful thing is that going around the encampments, going to different universities, traveling the country, this generation gets it. Like, I have to say, like, as much as we have challenges, we do have challenges, yes. But I've never seen so much willingness to take on this whole thing as I've seen in the last 10 months. And so I think that this is sort of our chance, that we have to sort of, to answer my question earlier, Zionism would have us give up our Islam, or the Islamic component of our resistance, in order to get our struggle to be legible and legitimate. Go the human rights discourse route, go the UN, two-state solution, peace process, all these things that we've seen before. That is the barter and the exchange that Zionism is trying to force us to engage in. To sell out the Islamic component, we'll be quiet, we'll stop saying Allahu Akbar, or stop talking about martyrs or whatever. We know that it's scary, it can get us in trouble, we can get arrested. We'll just go through this route, and honestly, frankly, that's a route in which that's a very favorable playing field to them. They've been conning the UN since the beginning. They've been conning and avoiding international law since the beginning. They've dared other nations to challenge them and hold them accountable, and they have successfully evaded it up until very, very recently, right? So I don't think that's a bargain that we should make. I don't think that we should be willing to sell that part from us. I think that this is going to be, it's not going to go away until it all goes away, and we basically have to face it head on.
Go ahead, brother.
No, please go ahead.
I was going to say, because it was such an open-ended question, I wanted to target you a little bit, brother, and just hone in on some of the questions that we're asking. But first, I want to say thank you to Imam Tom, because that was so comforting, because as organizers, we're never sure if we're doing it right. We just say Bismillah and try our best, so that's very, very reassuring. So we're kind of finding, like, the analysis, right, of, like, how on earth have Zionists reserved the right to literally weaponize the religion of Judaism, while Muslims have to feel the need to water ourselves down from our Islam in order to be considered valid or credible? So in terms of strategy, how do we get beyond just plain defense and get beyond, their initial claim of who we are? How do we stop playing in their arena and sort of reclaim control over the narrative and get to be our full Muslim selves in our full Muslim glory, and not fall beholden to playing defense all the time?
Yeah, thank you, Hadeeqa. I appreciate that, and I agree with Imam Tom. The question is a little bit like too generic. I want to talk about it from a different perspective, but I think your question is important. So I'll take it. I'll go through that. The answer to it, however, might not be too positive, not too optimistic, and I say this not to sound negative, which I know some people think I always sound negative, but it's important for us to assess and understand the reality in order for us to bring in positive change. The reality is simple in my perspective. It's easy for Zionists to allow the weaponization of anti-Semitism or the usage of Judaism to recruit people to join the simpler colonial project in Palestine, because Zionists had made peace with secularism, Zionists have made peace with modernity, and most importantly, Zionists had made peace or have made peace with colonialism and imperialism. Now, there's so much to unpack here. The reality is, and I know a lot of people like to take the easy way out and say AIPAC and other Zionist lobbies are controlling the US, but I think that's very simplistic, and I think that's very cobbing out and just taking the easy way out and explaining and not accepting that America, the country that we live in, a lot of people feel that this is their homeland and this is their country, is actually the ones who are running the show. And they're the ones actually using Israel for their own interest. Americans, since they started supporting Israel, specifically in the 70s, they, and most famously in the Congress, had a conversation and said, Israel is very important for our regional interest and is very important for our hegemony in the region, and we need to support it. And Noam Chomsky calls this relationship between Israel and the United States a client-state relationship, meaning that the U.S. as an empire, as the biggest empire in the history of humanity, cannot be controlled by a small state like Israel, which is smaller than any state in New York in America. Israel sees its client state as a catalyst for it to continue its hegemony in the region for reasons that are simple to us and all of us agree with, which is that if Muslims are united in that region, and since Muslims have not, quote unquote, made peace with secularism, have not accepted the modernity point of view in the world, then they are technically a problem to the European or the Eurocentric worldview, meaning the concept of capitalism, the concept of exploitation, the concept of racism and supremacy. Since Muslims have not accepted that, they are going to be a problem for us. And in order for us to maintain our hegemony in the region, we need to support this client state to do our dirty work in the region, to continue to divide Muslims and to continue for that region to be unstable all of the time. Now, to bring it back to your question, the only way for Muslims to be taken seriously and their religion to be taken seriously as a mainstream religion in America and anywhere in the world, specifically in the Western Hemisphere, is for Muslims to accept to secularize their religion and for Muslims to accept capitalism, imperialism, and exploitation. Zionism had made it clear since day one, and Theodor and Herzl, the founder of Zionism, have messaged or had messaged the colonial regimes, specifically Chamberlain in so-called Great Britain, and told him, I'm inviting you to partake and to be part of something colonial. The founder of Zionism categorized the state of Israel as a settler colonial project. Zionists did not shy away from categorizing Israel as a colonial entity. They were happy with categorizing as such because to them, in order for them to be supported by the colonial powers, they have to be part and parcel, and they have to accept the colonial worldview through a Eurocentric lens. So the reason why it's easy for American politicians to take Israel, and specifically the so-called Judeo-Christian traditions, what they mean by Judeo-Christian traditions are secularized worldview, and meaning that they're okay for us to accept capitalism as the economic worldview. It's okay for us to accept imperialism. It's okay for us to go and colonize the world, kill millions of people in Latin America, kill 1 million people in Iraq, just for America to continue its war. And this is why Zionism is accepted as in the mainstream in America, because they are in bed with American hegemony and they are in bed with American empire. Muslims cannot be taken the same way because we as Muslims cannot accept these worldviews. And this is a struggle for the Muslim community in America. In addition to what Imam Tom mentioned, if you take a step back and you go through the so-called the concept of assimilation, at the end of the day, Muslims are not natives to this land, right? And I'm not, of course, European white man is not a native to this land, but in the concept of assimilation theories, they technically considered natives because they took over the land now and they committed genocide against the natives. So they are the new natives. So in order for Muslims to be accepted as immigrants who came from Asia or Africa or the Middle East, in order for them to be accepted, according to assimilation theories, they have to get rid of their uniqueness. They have to get rid of their value systems and accept the native value system. The Native American value system is exploitive in its nature because we know of slavery. It's capitalist and imperialist in its nature because of American wars around the world. So in order for us to be accepted into becoming mainstream in America, we have to accept these so-called American value systems. I know most of the time, as Imam Tom mentioned, we like to invoke so-called the forefathers value systems, but those are very exploitative, very evil value systems. And this is what and this is why American community, specifically the Muslim community here, is so lost because they are trying so hard to be Americans, but they're having an identity crisis. What does being American mean? Being American means that you're okay with capitalism, you're okay with imperialism, you're okay with the genocide, you're okay with the war. As we've seen today, everybody is cheering Israel to continue its genocide in Gaza. Otherwise, you cannot be truly an American. And because of that, Muslim American community is really struggling to make to claim Palestine as a Muslim cause because to them, Palestine is an obstacle for them to be completely integrated in the American empire. They want to serve in the army, as Imam Tom mentioned. They want to be able to serve in the State Department. They want to be able to serve in the Pentagon. But every now and then, when Israel commits genocide, these Muslims in the establishment or in the administration are losing their minds. I'm not questioning intentions here, but the reality is they're not happy with what's happening, not in fear and worries about the people that are losing their lives in Gaza, but because it makes their life impossible. They want to be integrated. They want to be the face of the empire, but Palestinians are making it harder for them. And this is why a lot of them, like people like Wajhat Ali and others, are struggling with the dealing of the cause of Palestine, because to them, Palestine keeps reminding them that we as Muslims cannot be in bed with the American so-called value system of imperialism, and as such, struggling to define a Muslim American identity. I hope that made sense in answering your question. It might not be, I know people might be like saying, okay, you're being nihilistic. I'm not, but that's the reality. Muslims have to deal with secularism, and that's the reality that we're living in today.
That definitely does answer the question. And there's no expectation for it to be happy, because the unfortunate truth is that a lot of this history and current day is not happy. And we got to unpack that to be able to move forward. And I know Imam Tom wants to jump into this conversation and add to that. So I'm giving you this space.
Shout out to Mgage. Shout out to Mgage and all the other Democratic ops and all the other. No, Raja just like totally slaughtered that 100%. Like listen, I mean, how many WhatsApp groups am I in where I'm in WhatsApp groups with DNC delegates and with other people over here? They definitely view, oh no, here's that pesky Palestinian issue coming back again, stopping us. There's people who don't think that there's anything wrong with getting Departments of Defense contracts, right? There are people that brag about it. And they're like, we work in the Department of State, we work in the Department of Defense. Like, I'm doubting your Islam. Like, and you're proud of it. Like Raja's too nice to question intentions. I'm going to question intentions, like 100%, like seriously. And man, la ilaha illallah, like you go through the Quran and you see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he gives you typologies, right? And typologies are still the same. You've got people that will make every excuse, and in reality, their Islam is very, very little. I know we wanted to get into this later with what to do on campuses and people who are giving up pretexts for not getting involved in things like this. Yeah, confront yourself. Confront yourself with the truth that you might be too addicted to the dunya. You might be too addicted to fitting in. You might be too addicted to assimilating. You might be too afraid to lose your career. You might, you might want your little McMansion in the suburbs, and that's a you issue. That's not a, like, don't think that we're out here being crazy. Like, we actually care about Palestine and Palestinians and, this issue, because Allah will hold us accountable for it. Like, imagine, the Prophet ﷺ said there's going to be a group of people who, on the day of judgment, when they go to the Hawd, right? The Hawd is like the big pool where you get your final drink before you cross over into Jannah, and you're going to meet the Prophet ﷺ at the Hawd. And there's going to be a group of Muslims that meet the Prophet ﷺ, and he turns away from them. And he says, I don't recognize you. I mean, for me, there's a lot of things that one could do to make them qualify as that type of person the Prophet ﷺ would want to distance himself from. And selling out Palestine, or prioritizing your own career path or your own assimilation or your own Americanness or whatever you think that you're doing over Palestine, I think should be at the top of the list to get you to be rejected by the Prophet Muhammad on that day. And we ask Allah for protection from such cowardice.
There's a lot of good stuff there that I'm fighting the urge to jump on. But I'm going to take your argument one step further, Imam. And I think what it really sounds like is for a lot of people, they're, without realizing it, they're fine giving up their Islam, right? So like, Brother Raja, when you talk about Zionism, being so okay with the current system that we have, right? The modern nation state, the state of the world, it's a lot more severe than that. Like I think when you're studying how Zionism started, so I don't know how many of you are aware of Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro. So he's a rabbi, and he studied Zionism for just about all of his life, for 20 years, and he talks about how the founding members of Zionism had a real hatred for their religion, right? The way that the founding members of Zionism describe other Jews as cockroaches, as worthy of being killed, right? And essentially say, well, we are the reason that we came to this position, that Europeans are killing us en masse because we weren't strong enough, right? Because we didn't accept the parameters of the world of the politics that they set for us. And I think this is the greatest example of what giving up your moral values does. It gives up your entire religion, right? And so this is also like a promotion of his book, but I think many of you should try and read Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro's book, The Empty Wagon: Zionism's Journey from Identity Crisis to Identity Faith. But yeah, you illustrated that very well, right? Without saying it, you're essentially saying, I'm okay not being Muslim, right? Just as long as I'm safe. So this is sort of leading to my next question. And I think a good part of what you guys are talking about answers these questions, but I'd want you to sort of give sort of material examples, right? So what happens when the movement is led by secularism or other religious traditions, right? Is it simply examples where Muslims feel uncomfortable with, certain practices, or does it go to the extent that I'm arguing?
I mean, I don't want to be over deterministic because no one has a crystal ball. It's like, great, you can imagine a scenario in which a secular movement, liberates Palestine in some way, shape, or form. However, like, what we have to think about is, and I did an interview with Dr. Enes Takriti from the U.S., and he brought this up. When some people call for like a secular Palestinian state, right? Do we also realize that Egypt has a secular Egyptian state, and Jordan has a secular state, and Saudi has a secular state? And what are these secular states doing? What have they done for their people, right? In fact, they're just client regimes. They're just sellouts. They're the ones that are actually, directly participating. They're stopping attacks on the Zionist entity. They're the colonial informant and the supervisor, right? So what are we really building towards? Okay, now that doesn't mean that has to happen that way, and it doesn't mean that you can't it doesn't mean that it's a foregone conclusion. But if this is the type of thing that we're going after, I just feel like, and this is one of the arguments I made in my article, that it's very easy to co-opt that sort of thing. It's very easy to give very, very little. Right, just like they've been going. Now everybody's talking ceasefire. Ceasefire is nothing anymore, right? It's like even the Democratic politicians are just parroting this term, ceasefire, right? And thankfully, some people, even on the inside, have been trying to hold their feet to the fire and say, no, arms embargo, no, stop arming Israel, which is something actually real, as opposed to just an empty slogan, because they'll turn ceasefire into two-state, just like what they did with this peace process and two-state solution. It will be this legal fiction that's never it's always like an asymptote. You're getting close to it, but you're never actually getting to it, right? So, I mean, I think that the dangers of this thing, or of these types of tricks, are very real. Are they more real in a secular-led movement? Yes, I do personally think so, though I might be wrong about that. Another thing, though, I think this is incontrovertible fact, is that all of the other discourses that we're talking about that Zionism operates on, if the main discourse that Zionism operates on is anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim sentiment, then if you just have a secular movement, it's not going to address or dismantle that particular discourse or that apparatus. And so we might have a reality in which Palestine has some sort of recognition, a seat in the NU or in the UN. Sorry, it's late. And like other various, sorts of things that check the boxes of like legitimate statehood within the post-World War II international order, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe they've got neoliberal economics. Maybe they'll join NATO, right? We don't know, but we will not be safe, and a Palestinian who has a strong Islamic identity will not be safe, because we will not have taken down this other element, which is really, really important to it.
Brother Raja, if you'd like to take that question.
Yeah, sure. I was having a hard time seeing the unmute button. I'm getting old. Yeah, I think just to take a little further than what Imam Tom mentioned, I think it's important to look at this question from a little bit of a different lens. The reality is, as I was alluding to early on in my conversation, was the concept that we are byproducts of secularism. And the reality is, a lot of people, specifically in the West, and even people overseas, they look at the world through Eurocentric lens. They look at themselves through a Eurocentric lens. Meaning, as Imam Tom mentioned, why would someone who was born and raised in the Middle East, for example, say, "Oh, we want a secular state"? Like, where did that come from? The concept of secular state is completely a European byproduct. Like, this was created as a byproduct of the Westphalian Treaty between European empires, that they made peace with each other, and it was the inception of the creation of the concept of colonialism. Instead of fighting between each other after the 30 years war between the Protestant and Catholics in Europe, they decided, let's go about now and invade the rest of the world instead. So we are literally wants to find solutions to the problems that are coming to us from Europe by using European solutions. Like, it doesn't make sense to me. You're trying to, it's like the concept that many of us have this conversation all the time, the concept of decolonialism. And I don't want, of course, I don't want this to sound in a wrong way. Someone like Frantz Fanon. Like, I love Frantz Fanon. I learned a lot from him, and many of us have learned his work and inspired by him. But one big piece, when Moroccan scholar talked about this, is that he wrote a piece that was called "The Elephant in Frantz Fanon's Work." The elephant in the room was that Frantz Fanon himself failed to see the Algerian mujahideen, the Algerian warriors, through their Islamic sense. He did not mention Islam at all as a motivation for them to free their land. In his analysis, even though we agreed with the majority of his analysis that the natives refused to give up their homeland, but he refused to conceptualize and theorize that the concept or the spirituality that these mujahideen have, the tariqas, the warriors at that time were sitting and getting their energy from the Islamic teachings, that they have to defend their homeland. It's an obligation on them to fight back and defend their homeland. So we are refusing to acknowledge that as natives of the homeland, we have our own system and value system that teaches us how to deal with colonizers and how to deal with occupiers. We are trying to decolonize ourselves by using the same colonial framework that is given to us by our own colonizers. It sounds like an oxymoron. And this is the problem that we're facing today. And unfortunately, some people in the West specifically are, even though they're Arabs or even Muslims in their ethnicity, they're Islamophobes, unfortunately, some of them. They don't want us to talk about Palestine through an Islamic sense, because to them, we need to appease the liberal sensibilities. And the best way to do that is to talk about Palestine using a secular lens only. Now, again, I want to make it very clear. Personally, I'm against calling it because it's not accurate. Palestine is not a religious war at all. Now, but however, it is a Muslim issue for the reasons that Imam Tam and I mentioned. It's a Muslim issue because, Islamically speaking, we are obligated to defend our homeland. We are obligated to fight back against foreign occupiers, and it's also an Islamic issue because it's a holy land. But it's also, in my opinion, a more important issue, which is that the natives themselves are Muslims, and in essence, that means to protect themselves against the Sitla colonial project, they have to reassess their Islamic identity. Otherwise, if you remove and erase your Muslim identity, Sitla colonialism has succeeded because Jerusalem will be Judaized as we have been witnessing in the past 50 years. So again, to wrap this up, I want to say that I'm not saying we should go around and constantly give khutbahs every time we want to talk about Palestine, but we have to make peace that part and parcel of the Palestinian struggle is stemming from an Islamic discourse and from a religious discourse, and it's not something we have to deny. However, many people are, again, see the cause through that secular lens, and to them it's imperative because they have a misunderstanding of the cause, but most importantly, I think they have endorsed and embraced the Eurocentric analysis of the world, and to them, in order for me to cater for my liberal friends, in order for me to cater for my for anybody, and because they think winning the public opinion is more important than anything else, to them, they're more than willing to distort the narrative in order to win some friends and cater for the liberal sensibilities.
And if I could just add a tiny point that just so I clarify and everybody's very clear about what I'm saying. 100% agree. Like the reality on the ground is that any movement to free Palestine is going to be a very diverse movement. However, you want reciprocity. Okay, like that's the whole word that I keep coming back to. Muslims, I've never met a Muslim who's actually trying to completely ignore or erase the human rights element or the humanitarian element or the settler colonial element or all these other. But I meet plenty of leftists who want to completely erase the Islamic element. So like when I wrote the article for Facchine Institute, or when I, give talks after, like based on that, I just think that we need to try to establish reciprocity that, hey, we're totally, like willing to recognize we already do, but you can't sell us out for your liberal friends, like Rajat's saying. It's like you have to grant us that recognition as well. We belong in the conversation.
I think, yeah, I'm sorry if I jump in here quickly because I think this is very important. Thank you, Imam Tam. I think that reminded me of a very important point too. And we have to like discuss it like without hesitation. The question of Hamas really comes up all the time. And I think the reality is, and this is something we just have to accept. And unfortunately, many people don't know how to deal with it the right way. A lot of people deal with it in a way that is harmful to the Palestinian cause more than useful, because people are worried. And as I mentioned early on in my discussion about the war and terror campaign, America created this fear about anything that is Islamic in its nature, and they have demonized any Islamist, specifically people like Hamas or Muslim Brotherhood, in a sense that we are so worried about being linked with Hamas. We are so worried about being compared to Hamas as this terrorist organization, right? That we are willing to undermine the Islamic reality of the cause of the Palestinians in order to sell the cause or to package it in a liberal sense. We are seeing, for example, in the past 8 months, many people who are saying, oh, Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians. Oh, Hamas is the minority. Oh, the people who voted for Hamas are not even, don't matter anymore. Oh, only 40% voted for Hamas. And even this election was happening 20 years. What are we trying to get at? We're trying to basically demonize Hamas and endorse the narrative that the so-called conflict is between Israel and Hamas, and not that Israel is a settler colonial project that has a problem with every single Palestinian. But because before Hamas, Israel had a problem with the leftists. Israel had a problem with Fatah or secular groups, and they were committing massacres against them. They were killing their leaders. They were assassinating their leaders all the time. And that back then there was no Hamas. So the problem again, and this is the problem because we are living in an Islamophobic world, as Imam Tom mentioned, and Islamophobia and Zionism go hand in hand. And the work of Edward Said, who's a secular Palestinian and Christian Palestinian in the 70s, highlighted the importance of using Orientalist and Islamophobic tropes to demonize the natives. So what's happening now, if you demonize Hamas and undermine them, you're automatically demonizing and undermining Palestinians, because the reality is Hamas are part of the social fabric of Palestine. You don't have to agree with them. And the Palestinian resistance is not only Hamas. We do disservice to the Palestinian resistance if we say it's only Hamas. Of course not. There's Hamas, there's Islamic Jihad, the Palestinian Fronts for Liberation of Palestine. There are some Fatah factions. There are other secular factions. There are atheist factions. Yes, they're small, tiny bit, because the majority of Palestinians are Muslims and they're practicing Muslims. But the reality is, when you demonize the largest resistance movement, you're demonizing the Palestinian resistance in essence. But unfortunately, this discourse is forced upon us by these liberal elites that care so much about their careers and being accepted in mainstream media, because we know in mainstream media you can't go out and not demonize Hamas. If you see many of these famous people like Bassam Youssef or Mark Hill, what's his name? Mark Hill. Mark Lamont Hill and others, the first thing they always do is demonize Hamas all the time. They say Hamas is evil, what they've done in October 7 is bad, but let's move on with the conversation. So they establish common ground with the liberal American before they dare to talk about Palestine. And this is very dangerous because it embraces the Zionist movement. So you see here the issue with Hamas. It sounds like it's just an issue with Hamas, but the reality is it's an issue with anybody who has an Islamic point of view. And that's very dangerous. And I think bringing this up will make us better understand why, as Imam Tom mentioned, and as I explained before, why it's dangerous to remove the Islamic discourse from the movement, not to claim and to take over the movement and say only Islamists are allowed to talk about Palestine. Of course not. I mean, I've organized in leftist circles, and I still continue to do so. Those are our, Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Jews, Palestinian seculars, and leftists are the owners of the Palestinian cause too. We have Islamists should not have a sole exclusive ownership in the cause. We are partners in the struggle. However, when we try to demonize one part of it, even though we think it's useful for the cause, it ends up harming the cause more than actually benefiting it.
And to show how entrenched what Raja is saying is, just the other day, Jill Stein completely threw the Muslim Brotherhood under the bus. Completely, right? So, I mean, and here's the thing. It's like people don't understand. You think you're in your head that by throwing Hamas under the bus, that you're saving yourself. But the distance between, we all know that in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, what was the main thing coming out of Israel was ISIS equals Hamas, Hamas equals ISIS. Okay? Even if they moved on from that, it's very significant that they went that route. They know that in order to make the Islamic dimension killable, that is the door that they're walking through every single time. And guess what? The average Muslim in the West, there's less of a distance between you and Hamas than there is between Hamas and ISIS. If you think that Hamas and ISIS are anywhere near the same thing, you are an idiot. I'm sorry. Like, you absolutely have no brain cells. They probably died off from COVID or the COVID vaccine or something else. It's like the chain, they're not going to stop there. Like, that's the thing. It's like this game continues to go until, okay, first we're making the link between ISIS and Hamas, then Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood, then Muslim Brotherhood and MSAs, then, and to the point where La ilaha illallah is going to be criminalized, the Quran is going to be criminalized, talking about martyrs is going to be criminalized. If you cede ground in that particular arena, it's only going to endanger everyone, in addition to what Raja said. So that's an extremely important point.
Y'all are like speaking to everything we need to talk about right now. And I think the time has come where we let it get juicy and talk about the traitors and the sellouts and the people we've been wanting to talk about for so long. I mean, Mom's getting ready. I think we're just way too passive about it. I think we've always talked about, we know that they exist, we know that they're here, but they're in our circles. We organize with them, they organize with us. And I think we need to start talking about how as Muslims, we navigate those spaces, how we need to leverage our power to make sure that we do not get washed out or silenced in the process of these coalition buildings that we make, and just like how to stand firm. Yeah, and I want to pass that to whoever wants to speak on it first. And you know what? Imam was saying, I don't want to name names. Go ahead and name names if you want, please.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to hear what Reza has to say more, because obviously this was the subject of the article I wrote for Yaqeen Institute, and there's, by the way, there's many more articles to come, inshallah. But I mean, like, just the same way that the Palestinians were being passed over in the whole normalization and peace process, and October 7th stopped that, right? It was my hope that the article that I set out would stop the Islamically minded and Islamists from being passed over and sold out in these spaces, in these activist spaces. Especially in this particular moment of the resistance, and in this particular moment of the what I see on the ground as a bunch of Islamically oriented youth that are interested in doing things that are faithful to Islam, but don't necessarily have any particular group, and don't even find like an inviting atmosphere for that type of thing, right? So as we just said, the whole thing is about how are you going to carve out that space for yourself? How are we going to carve out a space for, again, not just Muslim representation, but Islamic representation without getting sold out by other people? And it is a matter of power, and it is a matter of leverage, and it is a matter of the other, in addition to reciprocity, the major word that I've been thinking about since, releasing the article is renegotiation. It's not that I hate leftists, and I was telling, Fatima and Hadeeqa before, I used to be an anarchist. I was an anarchist like my whole teens and into my 20s, right up until I, accepted Islam. I get the left. Like it's in me. Like any critique I have for leftists is like, it pains me, honestly. It's very, very like close to home. I don't see myself as outside of that. You know what I mean? But at the same time, it's like there needs to be a renegotiation of the relationship. If admission to the space is at the cost of us leaving behind the Islamic dimension of what we're doing, we need to renegotiate that relationship so that everybody understands you can't have us without the Islamic dimension. Okay? We don't want to, like Raja was saying, we don't want to take over. We don't want to be the only show in town, but we deserve to be partners. And right now, we're not partners. Right now, I feel like we're being used as props. I feel like the Islamists are being used as props. And I feel like even the Islamic resistance is being used as props. When you have people who are so virulently secular that they trash Hamas and they trash the Muqawama, and they're people calling Omar Suleiman an Islamic fundamentalist, Omar Suleiman, for God's sakes, right? It's like, this to me is something that we have to get over. We need a renegotiation of these relationships so that there's a reciprocity and a recognition that if we're going to do this, we're going to do it as partners. You're not going to throw the Islamists under the bus. Like, this is a really important thing, but I'm just repeating myself at this point. I want to hear what Raja has to say.
Yes, Imam. I think in this regard, I'm going to take a little bit different dimension. I think it's really imperative for us as a Muslim community to step up our game for a couple of reasons. Number one, I definitely think that the critique to Islamic movements, specifically in Palestine, has decreased in terms of how it was like 20 years ago. I used to remember it was not allowed to talk about Palestine from an Islamic perspective at all. So we are definitely seeing a lot of things are changing and shifting. But what it's really imperative here is for Muslims to really step up their game and to claim their position in the struggle. We should not be taking anybody's permission to talk about Palestine and to work on the cause of Palestine. The problem that we're facing today is that, and this is another problem that Imam Sam talked about and I talked about a little bit, is that the Muslim community itself is not investing its resources in the cause of Palestine. And the majority of people, specifically, like, for example, the hosts of this event, the SJPs, are now Muslim youth that are coming to university, specifically from the younger generation, and realizing how important Palestine is to not just overseas, but here. And I think now Gen X, specifically in America, are realizing that Palestine is it's part and parcel to your struggle internally here in America, because it's epitomizes the issue of capitalism and the issue of imperialism, and the issue of the humanization of people. It gets rid of the concept of dignity. The fact that these people in Gaza with no material means are dying for dignity, whereas people in the West are dying for money. So this is important to them. So it is imperative for us as Muslims to step up our game and attend more rallies and to plan events ourselves. We should not be waiting for anybody to plan and then we go and beg them to give us space. Now, this doesn't mean we shouldn't coordinate with them. On the contrary, like I work with leftists all the time and I'll continue to, and I'm proud of it. And I think all of us should be doing that. And the more we work with them, the more we make it clear that this is our space too. And we need, as Imam Tom mentioned, the renegotiation happen organically. The problem that I'm seeing, though, is that our Muslim youth are not stepping up, specifically Muslim men. And I'm going to say it very bluntly. Everywhere you go, you see Muslim women stepping up and leading. Look at this event, for example. Look at almost every SJP in New York City is led by women, Muslim women specifically, brown Muslim women. Whereas Muslim men are busy chasing the American dream, busy buying the latest car and watching basketball and watching football and all that nonsense, and wasting their life and wasting their youth on the American dream, and not doing anything for the sake of Palestine or for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because you working for the sake of Palestine, you're working for the sake of Allah. And that's the reality. But our Muslim women are left alone to deal with this. And eventually they have to get absorbed into the larger circles. If you see the protests, if you see the encampments, you don't see Muslim men. Of course, you see a few, but they're the same exact Muslim men that you see going around every single encampment. However, you see a lot of Muslim women, and you see a lot of leftists and non-Muslims in these circles. We are failing the Palestinian cause, and that's why the space or people are moving without us. And we cannot keep crying to say, well, you need to incorporate us if we don't step up our game. Why do we need to wait for others to lead the encampment and then we go and beg them to give us space? Why don't Muslim students organize something and step up their game, and then everybody else will join them? And the example of this, I think the perfect example of this is CCNY. I think the work in CCNY was mostly led by Muslim women with the help of other leftist circles, and it was a much more representative and more diverse encampments that happened in CCNY, because our Muslim women stepped up their game and they were, leading the efforts. So I really think this is an opportunity for us to say that the renegotiating, for us to reclaim our narrative as an Islamic cause, means that we have to do work. We can't just speak. And this is Imam Tam and I and Hadeeqa, we were talking about this before, is that leftists from a very young age, when they're in college, they are the jacks of all trades. They learn how to write. I've organized in leftist circles. I know how it goes down. One person is in charge of the event. They write a press release. They design a flyer. They create social media links. They spread the news. They write emails. They invite speakers. They're tech savvy. They learn these things, and this is why one person of these activists is capable of running a show by themselves, because they were trained how to do this. However, our people are not learned and they're not taught how to do these things because they're too busy watching football and NBAs and all that nonsense and wasting their youth in just chasing the American dream. So that's the reality. We can't claim something that we're not willing to put time and effort into becoming part and parcel of that. And of course, this is not to say that there isn't an Islamophobic wave within these circles that don't want Muslims to speak on behalf of Palestine from an Islamic perspective. I'm not saying that. And that, of course, that's very visible. But in my humble opinion, I think the biggest challenge for us is that we are not doing our job as an Islamic movement.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think actually we need to think really carefully about what are all the obstacles to that. So one of them definitely is hubb ad-dunya wa karahiyatul maut, as the Prophet said. a lot of one thing, something that Rajat didn't necessarily reference, but I think that contributes to the examples that he's bringing is red pilled. I think that being a lot of the guys are red pilled, and that puts them in this like high value man. I'm just gonna like work on my whatever, which leads them down this path. So it's like a lot of them. It's interesting. They're not sort of from what I see, and we might have different experiences. Like I don't necessarily see a lot of the same like our parents' generation, like chasing the dunya. I see like a red pill Andrew Tate chasing the dunya, which has a slightly different flavor to it. Just as bad for Palestinian activism, but like it's its own. It might be its own beast. And then you have neo-traditional Sufism, right, which basically says that if you resist, then you're expressing displeasure with Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, right? And you have Madkhalism or extreme Salafism, which is basically saying any sort of resistance is khuruj and you're a Khawarij, right? So these are all, we need like a typology of all the sort of players on the board and how to neutralize, right? Like all of them. I've been working extensively, not as much with the number one that Rajat mentioned, but I've been working extensively on the last two recently, trying to actually cultivate. And there are actually some Sufi groups that are interested in resistance. Didn't know that Ismail Haniya, rahimahullah, his father was the head of a tariqah, right? And when you when you give them stuff like this, they're like their mind is blown. So there's room for sort of bringing people from where they are to a certain place, and the same with Salafis. I think Palestine has exposed a lot of the extreme Salafis, and sort of they're in real like their stock is really down right now. So even people that I knew as someone who's a graduate of the University of Medina, people who were like 5 years ago were obey the ruler are now like death to MBS. Like seriously, like there's a lot of people that Palestine has changed them. And so we need to look for what are all the obstacles that are in play, how do we neutralize and remove them, and how do we make sure that we leverage so that we make good. We're basically betting on ourselves. Like Raj is 100% right. If we go to the left and say, hey, we want to renegotiate, then we want this and that and the third, and then we don't show up and make good on it, it makes us look like punks, right? We really need to make good on that and take care of inside and outside. We got a lot of cleaning up to do.
Yeah, subhanAllah. I'm going to throw out one last question and then we'll move to Q&A from the
Can
audience.
I'm sorry, Hadeeqa, I just want to add something quickly, if that's okay with you. I'm sorry. Every time Imam says something, it kind of clicks with something that I feel like it's important. And I think this is important because we're talking about Islamic concept or framing of the Palestinian question. And we cannot talk about that without talking about the reality of our youth. And I think Imam, Tom, I was referencing it to it, but I didn't want to go deep into it. But I think Imam did a great job at summarizing the different categories that we're facing with. But I think the first category that he mentioned, the red pill, new movement that we see in our Muslim youth today, it's extremely dangerous because I think it's dangerous not just from a political sense, but also from an Islamic perspective is extremely dangerous for the following reason. This red pill categorization of this youth is dangerous in a sense because it's following what we know as the Protestant work ethics, as Max Weber talked about this. The idea that linking the falah, the salvation of a human being, with their material success in dunya. And that's the Protestant worldview. The Muslim worldview is that our salvation, our falah, is the success in the akhirah, in hereafter, meaning that it's disconnected completely from material gains. What we're seeing today with this obsession with pimps like Andrew Tate and Dan Bills, whatever his name is, and these new guys that are Muslim men are obsessed with converting into Islam because they have, of course, the masculinity issue that they have, and they need this strong male figure that they're lacking in our Muslim community at large, because for many reasons, and we talk about this in a different setting. But this problem is not just has to do with feminism and masculinity. Yeah, that's part of it. But another part that is extremely dangerous is the secularization of Islam. The concept that we as Muslim Americans, to be successful, we have to follow the Protestant work ethics by being successful. And you can see by this the new concept of preaching for Islam is that, oh, become successful, oh, own cars and have factories and work in multinational corporations. This is how you become a good Muslim. But that's far from the truth. And that's what we're facing today. So when we talk about secularism and the importance of bringing in Palestine from Islamic perspective, we're not just doing that in essence of defending Palestine and advocating for Palestine. On the contrary, and I think this is why Imam Tom is highlighting these issues, and I highlight this issue all the time, is because when you are highlighting Palestine from an Islamic perspective, it means that you as a Muslim understand what it means to be a Muslim. What it means to be a Muslim is to fight for justice. What it means to be a Muslim is that you are practicing your acts of worship are for another end, and that end is to establish justice on earth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He has sent the messengers and the books and the Holy Scripture so we might establish justice. لِيَقِيمَ النَّاسُ بِالْقِسْطِ, to establish justice on earth. That's why we practice Islam. And that's the message of Islam. Allah did not send us to copy Protestant work ethics where become successful and become a high value man and all that nonsense. And this is why these people are obsessed with Andrew Tate, is because he's someone who's conservative, but also has money and has it all. And we want to be like him. And we think this is Islam. And this is why it's important, again, when we talk about Islamic perspective of Palestine, not just for the sake of Palestine, but also as a Muslim people to understand that the centrality of the cause of Palestine is essential in understanding our religion as Muslims. And that's essential. And I hope people understand that we need to step up our game. And this is why, unfortunately, our Muslim women are more understanding of the Islamic principles, because they're not stuck into this red bell Protestant work ethics nonsense that our Muslim men are sucked into.
SubhanAllah, you guys are killing it. You're killing it and touching on everything we want to talk about. My gears are turning in so many different directions, so I'm not even sure where to go with this. But I think that last point that Brother Raja really honed in on was reminding me of, and maybe I'm also looking at Brother Raja's screen, but it's reminding me of Malcolm X and, the idea of doing something by any means necessary, and thinking about like unpacking what that means, any means, like what are the means that we have available? What are the different outlets and avenues that we have? And when it comes to, you brought up the conversation about the brothers not stepping up. Fatima and I, trust me, we've had late night rant sessions about this in full. And I think, we've talked to the community, we've talked to the brothers on campus, and I think a lot of the disconnect comes from the approach and comes from the avenue. I think there is definitely a level of people using, kind of weaponizing qadr in a way to absolve themselves of responsibility. But then there's also the element of there are so many different avenues that we're seeing in which people use as a mode of change. So how do we sort of make sense of the different approaches and avenues that we take in the pursuit of politics? Because, this is like one of the first conversations I had with Imam Tam. I went up to him after a khutbah and I was like, Imam, I'm so scared of selling out. Like, what do I do? What do I stay away from? And because I think in this world where we're told that, politics has power and you got to get in there and there has to be Muslim representation there. You have to have Muslim lawyers. You have to have Muslim activists. You have to have Muslims in every direction. It's like, it feels like there's not necessarily a rule book. There isn't a rule book for how to approach it and how to go about it. So question is, like, tips, rule of thumbs that you guys have. I think we've kind of touched on a lot of it already. But, how do we go about achieving our demands and doing it in a way that is also pleasing to Allah and, inshallah, not selling out along the way?
I mean, one of the principal sort of things and corrections that I've been meditating on the past several months is our attitude has to change, right? Like, we need to, I don't think it's an issue of representation. Representation is way too easily co-opted and tokenized, right? Way too easily. And we see that. There are Muslims that are in the White House, staffers that were the last to quit. They're still working for the White House, There are Muslim Zionists. There are, Muslim this, Muslim that. We won't, when are we going to realize that it doesn't matter, right? If someone is a Muslim, even a Muslim president, they'll find a Zionist Muslim president. Like, it literally doesn't matter. right? It's much more an issue about keeping to our epistemic sovereignty and our principles and what's right with Allah and building power. Like that's the thing. Like politics is not as much about representation as it is power. And that's why I try to take people from the biryani diplomacy sort of mindset of just being likable and trying to ingratiate and really humiliate yourself to having something that is a credible threat that you can deliver, right? And we're talking legal threats here, like, votes, money, whatever, or being able to control something that somebody else needs. That's how power operates. Nobody is going to care about you. No one's your friend, right? It's just this sort of attitudinal shift. Whether it's law, whether it's, like Muslims are almost like too nice, right? It's like CARE, take it for example, let's name names, like CARE, like dealing with discrimination law. Okay, that's okay, but like that needs to be done, but the entire legal system is stacked against us. Who's going to take down these laws? Who's going to play lawcraft or lawfare? This is what Zionists do. This is what other groups do, right? Everybody's doing it to us. Sometimes it seems like we're the only people not thinking and acting strategically, right? That we're not willing to get our hands dirty. It's like, yeah, it's like the law is a very plastic thing. You can shape it if you, like put yourself in position. The Catholics planned for 70 years to reverse Roe versus Wade. Okay, they were successful. It took planning. It took strategic action. It took building schools that produced lawyers and getting those lawyers onto the Supreme Court, right? It's like things can be done, but you have to plan accordingly. And I know some of the questions here, I'm trying to also incorporate some of the questions that were asked in the Q&A. I know somebody mentioned specifically about what was it? Like protesting. It's like, okay, protesting is cool, right? But are we choosing the most impactful actions to achieve actual objectives? Or are we just getting out and venting? Okay, it's like there are situations, like the whole purpose of different types of protests and direct actions is to either make something so expensive and unpopular for somebody that they stop, right? Or is to create another type of leverage, right? So it's almost like we're not even viewing things properly. We've got these couple tactics here. Voting is one, protests are another. It's like, let's talk about reverse engineering. We want Minouche Shafiq, now I know she's gone, but we want her to, to change this thing that she's doing. What's her weak spot? What's the chink in her armor? What can we do to pinch her, right? Like, how do we get her in a compromised position? This is political thinking, and this is the type of thinking that I haven't really seen yet from the Muslim community that I think that we need to think. There might be situations where it's a vote somewhere. There might be situations where it's a protest somewhere, or it's a boycott here, or it's a direct action here. But like linking these things up sequentially as like, this is our goal, here's how we're going to achieve it, right? And these are the steps that we need to take to get there. I feel like I went a little far afield from what you asked, but I think like that's the type of thinking that we need.
I mean, yeah, I'm not going to go too far from Tom's answer. I like to, in general, like unpack everything. As some of my friends always tell me, I like to criticize everything. Or back in the day, you used to call me Raja ruins everything. My point, I'm gonna say, like, and just add to what Tom mentioned. I completely agree. We talked about early in the days about like the reality of the Muslim community in the past 30 years. One observation that social science, specifically sociologists, observed about Muslims is that after September 11, Muslims started being more more engaged in showing their patriotism to America. If you noticed, and many, I don't know, you have to like go back in history and read the names of Muslim organizations in the past. Everything now says like Muslim American, American Muslim, and everything has an American flag everywhere. Before September 11, you rarely see American flags in protests, American flags in offices, American flags in Islamic schools or in masajid. After September 11, the Muslim community were cornered into feeling that in order for them, as Imam Tom mentioned earlier in his talk, about how do we avoid being scrutinized or have any relationship with Al-Qaeda or, of course, most recently with ISIS, was to prove that we are also Americans. And the best way to prove that we are Americans is by raising American flags and by engaging in American ways of mobilization. And American ways of mobilization, the accepted way, the mainstream ways, are voting, protesting, and raising American flags in general. Now, the problem is, and this sounds contradictory from coming out of me because I'm one of the people who used to plan every single protest for Palestine in the past 15 years or so, until recently the younger generation is doing a better job than me, so I retired. But the reality is the American empire itself and the American democracy itself was created in a way that it's self-protecting against these means of mobilization and these means of dissent against power. Meaning that, let's say, for example, AOC, or so-called the squad. The idea that before Obama came, actually, let me take a step back. Before Obama came to power, I was in college, and I used to mobilize with the leftist groups, a group called Anti-War Network. It used to be called Campus Anti-War Network, CAN, still remember the abbreviation. When Obama came to power, and that was 2 years after the war in Lebanon in 2006, everybody was like in a revolutionary mode. Everybody was in the zone, and we wanted to destroy American empire. As soon as Obama won the election, the majority of people just gave up on protesting, gave up on organizing and mobilizing canvases, because to them, a black man became a president. And Obama, before that, was still himself as this radical politician that he's coming around to change the discourse. And eventually, everybody realized that Obama was just another figure, another head of the empire. Meaning that, to quote someone like Hannah Arendt, who talked about bureaucracy, said the most dangerous monster within empires are bureaucrats, or the bureaucracy itself. Because when you are stuck in a system that is designed to self-preserve, it's hard to change it. So you can vote all you want. At the end of the day, the empire's interest will be the ones that will be maintained, that will be leading the efforts. And you can take, for example, the past 10 months of the genocide in Gaza. The Muslim community has been voting nonstop. We had the squad in office. We had Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and AOC, and everybody else. We had built relationships with politicians. Muslims have spent millions of dollars paying politicians. As the Imam mentioned, the biryani diplomacy, inviting politicians to our masajid all the time, bringing NYPD to our masajid all the time. Where did that lead us? Zero humanization of Palestinians, demonization of protesters around the country, calling us anti-Semitic, calling us terrorists, calling us names all the time. So-called mayor of New York City, who claims to be the best friend to Muslims in New York City, in New York City. He's being demonized, these people. He called protesters in New York City terrorists, literally. And this guy comes to our masajid all the time and claims to be our friend. What I'm trying to say is that the Muslim community, in hopes of being completely accepted as Americans, they have given everything to the system. But eventually, we've achieved nothing. We're not able to even call for a ceasefire without being called pro-Hamas terrorists or being called anti-Semitic, let alone being able to preach a ceasefire, or for the American empire to accept, to even call for a ceasefire. Because even though so-called Biden and Harris calls for a ceasefire, they're not truly calling for a ceasefire to protect people of Gaza. They have zero mention of the suffering of the people of Gaza. Their emphasis is always about ceasefire to free the hostages. So there's a cause and effect. It's not a ceasefire to protect people of Gaza in the genocide. It's a ceasefire to free Israeli hostages. So even the centering of the ceasefire is not even to humanize Palestinians, but also to always centralize the Israeli security agenda or interest in this formula. So we have failed miserably in the electoral politics. And I can talk about this nonstop, as many people know that I'm passionate about this topic, and there's a lot of studies that I can quote and mention here. But the point I'm mentioning, and this is not to sound negative and nihilistic, but more of to be self-critical, that we as a community have not been able to achieve power in the best way possible. We have been, quote unquote, trying to build power by trying to be integrated in power itself. We had aspiration to be close to power, but not to challenge power. And this is very visible in the way we organize, in the way we mobilize, and the way we support politicians, and the way we were not able to even push for a single ask for the American empire on these politicians that we paid nonstop to them and we supported them nonstop. And our so called biggest allies have stabbed us in the back and have completely ignored us because at the end of the day, they are loyal to the empire. So, to summarize this, I think when Malcolm X, as Hadeeqa mentioned, quoted him, Malcolm X's emphasis on by means, any means necessary is pivotal and it's fundamental for us to understand. It doesn't mean violence, as some people think. By any means necessary, meaning that we have to divorce ourselves from the framework that is given to us by the empire and think outside the box. And unfortunately, our community has not been thinking outside the box. And that is what's essentially needed. And I want to end by saying, as Imam mentioned, you cannot challenge power by begging it. You have to make it hard for them to ignore you by making them continuing their policy costly for them. And that's the only way for them to concede for our demands.
That's an amazing way to close off. I mean, I think practically every question that we've had here has been answered in the last 5 minutes, mashallah. But what I really wanted to touch on is, the whole point of this, right, is to talk about solutions, right? This is an analysis, but it's also to come to the medicine of the situation, right? Which is to say, what we have been doing, right? It's been good. The momentum is there, but like, so long as I continue to see mangled bodies, crying mothers, like I'm not doing enough, right? And I'm speaking even as an organizer here, right? And I actually wanted to throw a question to my co-host, inshallah, which is to say that, for one, right, it's not enough to go home and feel tired and khalas, right? To say like, oh, because I came home tired, like I'm doing enough, like so something must be working, like. I know it's really hard to do, and I'm saying this as somebody who's had to ask myself these questions, like, was that useful? Like, was that successful? It's a very hard question to ask, and it's a mean question to ask yourself. But what's the point of it, right? If we're constantly screaming to avoid, and for you that also feels like enough, right? Like there has to be strategy here, right? And what does this bring up? I think two flaws, right? Which is the person that goes home tired and they're like, well, I did something. I went home tired, so I must be doing something. And then in the same sentence, it's almost the same people that are like, yeah, like the system is screwed. Like we're not, it doesn't work for us. Which right, the system is screwed. But like, did you ever try to play the system? Did you ever try and see what power you do have? Did you ever try and attempt in the many ways that Zionism plays the system? I don't think Muslims have utilized that, right? So this comes back to the conversation we had before, where Zionists are always able to weaponize religion. Why haven't we been able to, rightfully so, weaponize it, right? Or to at least say it, right? And I think I want to throw this question to Hadeeqa, actually, which is like, what can we as people who are looking on in hope, what can we do to build more sustainable and strategic forms of power building for Gaza?
Yeah, thank you for that. I was talking about Qadr and how people have weaponized it to absolve themselves of responsibility. I think on the other end, on the other extreme as well, a lot of us in the organizing scene, a lot of people who have shown up to every single protest, tell themselves at the end of the day, okay, I've done my part. Alhamdulillah, the rest of these Muslims, they're just sleeping ducks and, nobody's doing their part. I'm the only one doing my part. And they think that, and I'm saying they's, whatever, I'm pointing blame. And they think that, okay, my work here is done. And I think there's a sort of huge, like, underlying arrogance to that, because there's this sort of assumption that whatever we do, we have the capacity to free Palestine overnight. And I think a lot of the rhetoric that we throw out, like, we will free Palestine within our lifetime, it's amazing, and it's inspirational, and it really moves us, and it pushes us in the right direction. But I think at the end of the day, it kind of does. If we're not saying inshallah at the end of that sentence, it's kind of losing the picture, and it's bringing us off balance a little bit. And I think a big part of what we can do is to recognize our role, and one, our capacity to do things, and our capacity to also be limited in what we're doing. So for example, I think we've talked about it a lot as well throughout this. I'm seeing it a lot throughout the comments. I'm trying to synthesize as well with the Q&A. But they say to, if you don't see something that's proper, you change it with your fist, with your hand. If that doesn't work, you go to changing it with your tongue. If that doesn't work, you change it with your heart. You make dua. And I think a lot of the time we go straight to making dua. And not to diminish what dua is, it's not a passive thing to do. But if you're not utilizing all these resources and all the capacity that you have at the same time, simultaneously, it is passive. It becomes passive because that's not recognizing your role in the situation. So I know that as somebody who's a part of SJP, somebody who's a part of organizing, we call people to come out every single time, and we get so frustrated at the fact that our numbers have been dropping. We've seen our protests from October and September of this year, and subhanAllah, it's about to come up, inshallah, to be a year of this genocide. Inshallah, it doesn't get to that point, but it's been 10 months of seeing how the momentum has slowed down, how people's capacity has slowed down, capacity in that sense that people's enthusiasm has died down. But the biggest thing is that we're not going based off of feeling. We don't go based off of, oh, well, I have energy today, and so I'm going to go protest, and I'm going to go make sure that my feet are burning by the end of the day, and after that happens, alhamdulillah, success. There's so much more nuance to that. It's the fact that I'm sorry, sorry. Were you able, can you hear me? Okay, alhamdulillah. Lost my train of thought now. But I think there's so much to it that we need people to come out despite whether or not you're feeling up for it. We need people to come out despite whether or not, oh, well, like I have just like this thing, I have this like thing on Monday, and like if I push it, it's just gonna look bad, and my boss might like say something, whatever it may be. We need to be able to put Palestine above ourselves. We need to be able to put the discipline of our organizing and the strategy of our organizing before whatever we're feeling. And I think a lot of our culture of like individualism is very like, I'm going to do this because I feel good. How many times are you, like, as Muslims, we all understand this. How many times are you so tired? You're not trying to wake up for Fajr. You're not trying to wake up for Fajr, and it's not something that you're nafs and something that you want to do, but it's something that with proper discipline, if you do it, is the right thing to do. And it keeps you on the right path. And what we're trying to do is be on the sirat al-mustaqim. So we protest, and we put protest and discipline and the movement before ourselves. We put the sake of Allah before ourselves. And then we also we think strategy. We think about, yes, we need to protest. We think about, yes, we now, alhamdulillah, we're in a really unique generation where we have the tool of social media. What are you doing with your social media? How are you using it? Are you educating people? How do these conversations go on campus when you interact with a Zionist? How are you engaging with it? Are you walking away? Personally, I like to walk away. Or are you engaging? Are you going on the defense again? And I think we all have had our experiences with these encounters. We've had our experiences with, oh, well, I have a role to play in this moment. I think making it, and it sounds so much easier than done, I understand, but making it so important that we bring up Palestine in every conversation is not at all passive. That is the most we can do, is to bring it everywhere we go. And so Fatima, I don't know if this answers your question, but we need to be coming out nonstop, day after day, and we need to also stop with the excuses. We need to stop with the excuses, and this is a self-crit as well. I do it all the time. We all fall victim to this individualism of, oh, well, my tummy hurts today. Your tummy's gonna hurt again, and at the end of the day, this is what we go through is nothing compared to the people of Palestine, nothing compared to the people of Gaza. If you can look at a baby, if you can look at beheaded babies, and if that's not a means of driving you to do anything and everything necessary to escalate and to resist for Palestine in whatever capacity that you have, I don't know what is. And I think there's also something to be said about the very, very crucial role that we play in the West. Yes, there's our obstacles and challenges that we have in the West, but there's also so much advantage we have here. We have such a unique opportunity living in the West to have webinars like this, to have conversations with our MSAs, to go into little coffee shops and try to spread out our lit and our pamphlets and tell people what we're up to and to protest. Kind of love protesting. And we have a lot of, I don't know if I'm gonna say we have a lot of right, but we have a lot of wiggle room in what we're able to push and the resistance that we have here. So really honing in on that, I think, is so important. But I also kind of want to throw it back to you, Fatima, if there's anything that you would add to that.
There's so much there. Like, I'm gonna try and stop going on a tangent or yapping too much, but I think there's so much practical that I can outline for people, attendees that are watching this. That is, it's right in front of you, right? Like, man jahida shay'an kariha, right? Like, you can also be going to the protests and saying like, well, the system's definitely rigged, so like I'm not gonna participate in something. But like, there's nothing wrong with you playing the system. There really isn't. And it's only because, for one, you haven't realized the power that you have. Like, I believe the majority of the people here I'm talking to are CUNY students. Like, you're in a public system. There's actually money there, right? And you haven't taken it up. Like, I just want to give like actual like practical like facts here that are just, I don't think a lot of us are realizing. Like, Hallels use your student activity fee. They use your tuition money to promote Zionism. The fees that you pay for your overpriced education, because it is, honey, it's being used for that type of propaganda. Like, in a lot of ways, I think, for one, you have to be able to educate yourself to the power that you do have, and just also on a personal level, I want you to hate the dunya, right? Like, sometimes when we're talking about the critical parts of this, I'm also speaking as someone who's, I don't want to say I'm brave. Brave isn't the word. I'm a yapper. my mouth goes off, you know what I mean? And sometimes I'm angry at people and I'm like, why can't you see the ridiculousness in that? And like, we're, Hadeeqa knows this, we're constantly like throwing the bid'ah arguments here and there. And not that they're valid, they're not valid conversations. But I think it also comes down to bravery a lot of the time. Like, a lot of people they're still scared. They're still anxious, right? Like, but being a Muslim at the end of it means that you will always be a target. From the beginning of the message being brought down to the end of times, like, this deen didn't come as like, hey, like, if you guys want it, like, it's a nice religion. If you want to be Muslims, come be Muslims. You know what I mean? And we're your friends at the end of the day. At the end of the day, you're always going to be a target. Whether you're wearing your hijab or you're growing out your beard, you might as well act on it, right? So I think that's what I would close off with.
And I think that's why Imam Tam and Brother Raja had opened up by saying that, if you're not seeing this as your issue to deal with, then something is wrong. There is an illness, there's a disease, something messing up the system inside that's telling you that this isn't your business. Not only is it your business because your tuition and your tax dollars and everything that you're doing is feeding into this and is profiting off of this genocide and colonization and settler colonialism, but you're a human being, you're a Muslim, and these are your brothers and sisters. And I think, I saw a question, and I'm not calling anyone out, but this is a popular question, is like, how do we, we don't want to get doxxed, and we don't want to get suspended, and we don't want to get arrested. How gangsta are you? That's just my question. How much are you willing to do it? And I know everyone has their own risk levels, but at the end of the day, that's a question to ask ourselves. How committed am I to this? To what extent of my personal material gains am I willing to sacrifice for this bigger noble cause? And subhanAllah, I truly believe that when your heart is in the right place, if you get suspended, if you get doxxed, because it's bound to happen when you're doing a righteous cause and when you're doing something for the sake of Allah here in the West, it will never ever be in vain. And the true believer does not fear that, because the true believer knows that the akhirah is a promise. And the true believer knows that none of this is in vain, that this is all jihad, that this is all ibadah, and that this is all counted for by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the conversation of doxing, the conversation of getting arrested and suspended, I think it's time for Muslims to start to say, all right, so what? Do what you want. I'm gonna do what I gotta do, because it's about time to do that. And I know everybody has their own families and has an education and everything. It's just a question. And a question that I think, inshallah, we can all go home with and to self-reflect and ask ourselves, what are we willing to give for this cause? And if there's anything preventing us, what is it?
If I may, it's also an issue of critical mass. I mean, if you are a lone individual getting punished by an administration, then you're very vulnerable and they will try to make an example out of you. But there is a number at which that stops to be a possibility where they can't do it to all of you. And so you really need to study, these sorts of things and build that sort of relationship and network and power where you're too big to be messed with in some sort of way, right? I think a lot of this comes down to, and this is interesting that you connected the sense of burnout with a lack of strategy. I think that's a really, really significant point. We're almost like in startup phase where it's like we're almost like measuring what we're doing in terms of energy output, and we need to transcend that and get to the next level up, which is where we're actually now using metrics to measure our effectiveness. How are we being effective? How effective are we being? Instead of that protest, should we have done something else over here? If there's one professor like that Shai Davidai guy, how do we get him, in trouble, right? What are the ways in which his professorship is sort of tenuous or maybe in jeopardy, or at what point will it be in jeopardy? How to create a situation in which he's in jeopardy, right? Like that might, in a particular situation, that might have more impact and might silence, this is what the Zionists do, that might silence 100 other professors. If you're able to take out somebody like that and make an example, that might shut up 100 more, right? So this type, I really hope that we can crack as the new school year is upon us, like to crack through this type of just like almost automatic cruise control and lack of imagination for sometimes a lack of imagination in the types of actions we do, and start to really think creatively about where do we prioritize things? What's the biggest threat here? What's our biggest opportunity? Which domino, if we knock it over, is going to knock 20 dominoes over, right? And I think that everybody will both be more inspired, will be sort of have more gas in the tank, right? If we're able to sort of like do this type of thinking.
It's 8:18, and I do want to honor everyone's time here. I promised Imam, Tom, and his wife that he would be done by 8:20, inshallah. So I want to close off by giving room for anyone to add last thoughts, whether Raja, Fatma, if there's anything.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be quick. I've read some of the comments and some of the points that you folks mentioned. One thing I want to say is that nobody's asking anybody to be a martyr. Nobody's asking anybody to risk your role for the sake of Gaza or the sake of Allah. I mean, that's between you and God. But the reality is that should not be used as an excuse, because one excuse I see all the time is that, oh, these protests are useless. It's not useless when it's the only way for us to show our rage against the genocide is happening in Gaza. It's not like we're coming out to a protest asking for public school funding and we think it's not going anywhere. It's something you have to show your rage. The least we should do is to go out and protests. If you don't think it's useful, that's fine. Stomach it, shut your mouth, and go to the protest. If people in Gaza are wanting the protest, the sisters are planning the protest, the brothers are planning the protest, go to the protest. Don't speak up about, oh, there's free mixing in the protest, or they're not praying. Just غض البصر. Just keep your eyes down. If you need to pray, step aside, pray your salah, and go back to the protest. Don't make a big deal of it. Do not be the American, do not invoke American exceptionalism in everything you do. This is not about you. This is about the 40,000 people that are slaughtered in Gaza and the more people that are continuing to be slaughtered. The least you can do is to show rage. So if you don't want to be arrested, nobody's asking you to be arrested. Go to the protest. If you feel things are getting out of hand, just step aside. Protect your sisters as much as you can. And we have to understand too, is a lot of us, as either first first generation or second generation immigrants or third generation immigrants, we come from police states. And we think because our parents are so protective and so scared of police officers, we think police officers in America are like gods, like back home. It's different here. There's freedom of speech. Many people who get arrested were dismissed on the same night. It's nothing serious, right? It's just NYPD illegally arresting people, and eventually the attorneys get you out in no time, right? This is how they control the masses. So there's nothing to be scared of. Being afraid of being doxxed, you can wear a mask. Nobody's going to dox you. Nobody's telling you to leave the protest if you're afraid, right? I was doxxed all my life. Alhamdulillah, I had jobs over after jobs, and I got good jobs. And alhamdulillah, Allah blinded them from being able to stop me from getting jobs and living my life and taking care of my family. I don't. At the end of the day, of course, for me, I don't care. Allah Subhanahu wa Taala will take care of me eventually, but I'll take means. I'll do my best to protect myself and protect my family because the mainstream is against us. But you cannot be using these excuses to not do something. The least we can do is to support people. If you don't want to go to every single protest, go to a few of them. You don't want to go at all for whatever reason, even though you should not be having an excuse, reach out to the GPs, give them money, support them, ask the sisters what kind of support they need. You can do something. But to stay in your home and say, oh, Brother Raja said, the whole system is corrupt, there is nothing for me to do. No, yes, I'm saying it's completely corrupted so we can come up with better strategies. But until we do, you need to do something about it. And I want to end by reminding people that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala communicated with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the first time Jibreel came to him and explained to him what Islam is about. And then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam went to his wife Khadija and she took care of him, and he was like overwhelmed by the situation. What did the Jibreel come back to him and tell him? Ya ayyuhal muddathir qum fa'anzir. Like you the prophet, you're covering yourself, what are you doing? Now that you know, stand up and warn people. So it's our job as Muslims to step up and do action. It's not enough to stand with Palestine in spirit. It's our job as Muslims to act upon it. And acting upon it, the least we can do right now is to show rage, to end the genocides. And whether you believe in it or not, do the least you can do to go there. So you should not, nobody has an excuse. That's the reality. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold you accountable. If people in Gaza right now are facing genocide 24 hours, you have no excuse to say, oh, I want to focus on my job. Your job is 9 to 5. If your job is taking more than 9 to 5, then you are not understanding what Islam is about. Islam is not you having a job 24 hours and making money. That's not what Islam is about. Islam is standing up for justice and making sure that you're defending your religion and defending your people overseas.
Thank you so much, Brother Raja. I think that reminds me of, I think it was Brother Imam Sulaiman, who said that what fears them the most is how fearless we are. What breaks them the most is how unbreakable we have been, and what shatters them the most is just how unbothered and unshattered we are. So subhanAllah, this idea of rising up and seeing the NYPD and saying, all right, we're good, is really huge, subhanAllah. And I think it creates a huge sense of hope. So I want to close out with a dua, inshallah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep us steadfast, to keep us firm in our jihad and in our protests. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to purify our intentions across all of this. Al-Qudus, Ya Allah, we ask you to purify our intentions and purify the means in which we are doing this, the means in which we are thinking about this, and the means in which our heart is accessible to you. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to liberate Palestine, to liberate Masjid al-Aqsa, and allow us to all pray together, inshallah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to let us all pray together in a liberated Masjid al-Aqsa, in a free Masjid al-Aqsa, in a free Palestine, in a free Jerusalem. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to end the genocide in Gaza, to give might and to give sabr to our brothers and sisters in Gaza, to reunite the families, the martyrs that we are seeing coming out of Gaza in Jannah al-Firdaus. Ya Allah, we ask you for only barakah in the work that we're doing. We ask you to bless the families of every single human being in Gaza, every single person in Palestine, all of our brothers and our sisters. We ask you to give victory to every single part of this ummah that is oppressed, whether it is in Palestine or Kashmir or Bangladesh or Congo or Sudan, wherever it is, Ya Allah, we ask you to uplift this oppression and let us be a means of fighting for them and let it be pleasing to you, Ya Allah. Ya Allah, we ask you for only the best in this dunya, in this world, and in the next, Ya Allah. Bless the families of Imam Tam and brother Raja and Fatima and every single person that's been a part of this event. We ask you to reunite us all in Jannah. Allahumma ameen. Thank you so much, Imam Tam, brother Raja, Fatima, everybody for joining and making the time to hop on today. May Allah make this beneficial and let it be a means of accounting for us on the day of judgment.
Thank you, everybody.
Recording stopped.
Jazakumullah khair. Thanks, everyone. All right.
Assalamualaikum. Thank you all for joining. Assalamualaikum.
Thank you.